Right, let's kick this one off. Welcome, everyone. Apologies for the short notice for today's space, but it is going to be a good one. We're joined here today by Simon Brown. He's the co-founder of Shodai Network. Correct me if I'm wrong on that pronunciation, Simon.
No, that's it. You got it.
He recently moved over from Consensus after helping to build out their network state project. Very experienced guy, with a real passion for um, all the things that we care about here at Logos. Um, so today we're talking about a world after coordination collapse and what awaits us following the decline of nation states. So, without further ado, Sterling, do you want to kick things off?
Absolutely. This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. I think anyone here knows that as well. So I do believe that Simon and I will have a really fantastic discussion. Let me start, guys and friends of the Logos Network, with a typical disclaimer set here. So number one is any of the ideas or thoughts, opinions that Simon and I share. These are the products of our own minds and not affiliated with the Logos brand, movement, or legal identity, right? Disclaimer number two is if we happen to bring up any type of project, cryptocurrency project or otherwise, nothing that's said here is to be taken as financial advice. Please ape into and or YOLO into any kind of crypto project at your own peril, right? I think that's a given. The next piece of the puzzle is that this is a community space. Of course, we do on Thursdays have a guest segment. So Simon and I will have a discussion for about 60 minutes, and then we'll allocate 30 minutes for anybody who wants to come up and ask Simon questions, or if you want to engage in the discussion. If you really have a burning thought related to the discussion, we'll let you up earlier and maybe see if we can squeeze you in depending on where we are at in the conversation. But we are very much open to this being a community forum. So thank you guys for that. Sweet. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into this because we have quite a bit to talk about here. And Simon is just a wealth of knowledge, and I think you guys are going to appreciate it very much. So Simon, why don't we start for those guys and gals in the space who don't know you? Feel free to take the time to introduce yourself, brother, and share anything you want with the community before we dive into the topic.
Oh, thanks, Sterling. But yeah, you already introduced me. I'm a wealth of knowledge. There you go. That's all you need to know. I think that I'm not a wealth of knowledge compared to you, Sterling, especially having read so much of your writings that you've published. I am, however, very interested in a lot of what you've put out and incredibly interested in a lot of what Logos is doing. And this sort of just kind of conversation around network nations in general. So I'm delighted that you've invited me, and I can't wait to kind of chat to you guys about this stuff. Quick intro on me, for those who don't know me. I've been in crypto since about 2017. I worked first for something called FCAT, which is the Fidelity Investments blockchain research team. And they're one of the best teams in the crypto space, but probably not that well known. And that was like an incredible part of my career. Was there for 3 years? 3 years, and then moved over to Consensus. I've been in the in Consensus itself and in the Consensus constellation for over 4 years now. And most recently, co-founder of Shodai Network, which is trying to get like a peer support network off the ground, but we're actually focusing on a couple of different things. And I can get into that a little bit later. But yeah, this is where I am at the moment. Really excited to be here. I'm looking forward to kind of digging into some of the questions I've brought, more so than like topics that I want to talk about, but questions I'd love to pick your collective brains about.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks for sharing that info, Simon. Cool. So let me provide some context for the discussion today, and then we'll open up with maybe one or two of your questions here, Simon, to get the brain juices really flowing. So this discussion, we're going to do quite a bit of futurism here. I can imagine a bit of speculation, but we're also going to try to understand the current status quo. So what we're really looking at, guys, is the current status quo in terms of governance failures, coordination failures, And specifically one kind of coordination failure, which we can just describe here as wealth inequality and the rising rates of wealth inequality in our world. And then we'll eventually look at the technological, especially blockchain and blockchain adjacent, like parallel society solutions to this in a variety of ways. But then we're going to broaden the horizon a bit too, and we'll explore different ways that our future can iron out after the Westphalian nation state and the nation state system as it stands begins to decline more and more. But I would imagine, and I'm going to let Simon provide some input on this, that wealth inequality certainly seems to be a major indicator in some aspects of civilizational decline, in nation state decline, and that's helping us really transition into this post nation era. So maybe first, Simon, we can talk about, at least I'm going to have this first question pretty broad, so it gives you really the ability and the capacity to explore this area at whatever level you want. So really, what is our current like economic state and political state of affairs in the current like nation state era? And feel happy to get into this wealth inequality question and why it's relevant.
Yeah, there's so many different ways to answer that, and so many different answers depending on who you ask. And some people look at it from the perspective of like analysis of macroeconomics, macropolitics, political science, even history. You could quote Ray Dalio, for example, and there's a lot of commentary there. And people who are more familiar with it than me. I'm coming from it from the perspective of what I see day to day in my everyday life. And the impact that wealth inequality is having on people. And I don't think it's just like wealth inequality is a new problem, obviously. And you know, the counter argument is just like, yeah, well, inequality might be increasing, but so is wealth across the board, right? So like the standard of living has increased for everybody, and so you know that's okay. But yeah, I don't think so. I don't think it's an acceptable trade-off. And the reason that this question is what I'm bringing to this group, and why I'd love to discuss it, is because to my mind, this sort of wealth inequality is on a very established and irrefutable trajectory. Like it has, you know, been increasing for the most part of the last century, but since 1971 has just like dramatically started increasing. What one would like think exponentially. There's actually a great resource if you're not familiar. It's called WTF happened in 1971.com, and it's actually a community of you know, activist economics who gathered data on increasing inequality across the world. And yeah, so like I can share some numbers and some statistics that would shock you, or I can drop them, but I think we all understand the writing is on the wall. There is this established trajectory. And if we take that as like two fundamental axioms, one, there is wealth inequality. Two, wealth inequality is increasing at least superlinearly, if not exponentially, then the only logical deduction, right, is that that wealth inequality will at some point, that trajectory will reach some sort of inflection point, some sort of critical mass. I mean, that's just logical. It's not like subjective, it's just math, right? So what I'm most interested, you know, in discussing and getting opinions on is like, one, when does that inflection point actually happen? 50 years, 15 years, 10 years, 5 years? And what happens once we reach that inflection point? And that's where it starts to get subjective and speculative. Yeah, and so from my perspective, it's like, okay, well, I think that what's going to happen is this inflection point is not going to be like this sort of revolutions. You know, it's not going to be like a French Revolution where we chop off some heads and start again, right? I don't think we have the capacity to do that. I don't think we're going to see violent, like we might see some violent protests or demonstrations, but it's not going to be a violent revolution. Those days are gone. Mostly because, first of all, I don't think we have the potential to coordinate like that anymore, right? Which might be a good thing, right? So no more violent mobs. I don't think that's necessarily true. We will see them, but the ability for us to reach consensus has been lost because of the wealth of misinformation and the fact that our main communication pathways have been captured by large corporations who will sell the ability to influence those communication pathways to the highest bidder. So that's not going to happen. So we can all sleep well, no big revolution. What I would speculate is going to happen is that people will just find it hard to meet their everyday needs. And I'll give you a very real example that I haven't read in academic literature or heard in a Ray Dalio podcast, but just simply, I don't know how my kids are going to afford to buy a house. I just don't know how that's going to happen. So like, how do you provide accommodation for yourself? With the cost of living increasing across the Western world, how do you do stuff like support your family if you live rurally and you need a car? Or just even for a lot of people, unfortunately, groceries, right? So we're kind of like seeing this trend whereby people are arriving at the point where the nation state and the systems as we know it are not going to meet their everyday needs and they'll have to turn to something else. So that's the question. So at what point does this inequality inflection point create this sort of force majeure that forces people to turn to alternatives, this sort of emergent shadow economy, if you will? What does that look like? Will it be technologically facilitated, technologically driven? Will they finally start turning to the sort of tools that Logos is building today because it's the only thing that will work for them at the time? I kind of think that's the way it's going. But rather than kind of like give a lecture backed by tons of like, books I've read and various different, articles and different facts and figures, I'd like to just kind of turn up with that question and really kind of like harvest the sort of insights of the people who are most deep in this space at the moment to see what they think.
Yeah, and so Simon is very much open to you guys coming up and engaging in the conversation with us. But I have a lot of thoughts on this. So Simon, we can we can get after this and dissect this discussion quite a bit. Because I think when we're talking about wealth inequality, to begin with, what we're really talking about is a kind of governance failure, and governance failures really are and really a system failure, right? Because the only reason that wealth inequality is really a problem at all is because the nature of the system that we're embedded in is naturally exploitative and extractive, right? And so what happens when people are in this system and the game theoretic dynamics are structured in such a way where individuals are trying to optimize for their own well-being at the expense of everyone else, well, very naturally we have a lot of upward momentum in terms of like capital being allocated around certain individuals or certain groups of individuals, which exacerbates this issue of wealth inequality in sort of a one-sided fashion. And of course, this is compounded by a number of other institutional failures. This is generally you mentioned like mass media control, narrative control, various forms of population control, right? This sort of surveillance economy that we're based in, where the population is sort of kept at bay, where the narrative that they receive is often one-sided in terms of its political ramifications. So I do think like wealth inequality is one part of this greater scheme of control that is built in to these legacy structures, really by design, right? It's not even coincidence. Just thinking about education, for instance, the education system is based on the Prussian model of education, which by design is geared to churn out worker drones, right? People who can go to the factory, who can produce a widget, and then who can be sent off to war to die for a country, right? This is the system that we're built in, and the wealth inequality component of this is really the straw that broke the camel's back, right? It is by design how the system is supposed to be built up. So I do, and of course, then we can get into the question of what is the final moment. Well, I think we're already seeing, and this is what we can get into, Simon, and we can take the conversation where you want. But I do think that with the advent of Bitcoin, right? We can start with Bitcoin. It was a political statement, right? This notion, even written into the Genesis block of Bitcoin, Chancellor on the brink of second bailout. That the suggestion there is that there's an implicit understanding that there's great wealth inequality, but not only that, an extractive mindset built into the fiat hegemonic reserve currency apparatus, where this system is naturally unfair because some guys can print out as much money as they want, then they can just take that money back as they see fit through a tax regimen and otherwise control the population. So, but now we have invented a parallel economy through these cryptocurrencies. And I'm not here going to make a case that Bitcoin is even the right fit for that or good, because it doesn't obviously have any privacy guarantees. That's a bit of another discussion. But it is to suggest that we have a heterodox reaction to this orthodox paradigm of control. So anyway, I'm not sure if that's exactly where your thoughts are steering, but that's, as I was reading your material and documentation, this is the current situation as I see it. And we are in the middle of a bit of an inflection point right now, but maybe we're not fully at the point of a paradigm shift or a complete turn. But maybe you can get into that a little bit more too, and we can hedge the conversation on that.
Yeah, well, first of all, I agree with everything you said. And it's even like, obviously, I think most people here would be familiar with the sort of like reaction to the monetary policy, the monetary system, how it's designed, and even just like how money is designed with like debt built in. You know, a central bank creates money and gives it to banks to disseminate, but the like, you know, debt isn't built right into the actual unit of account. So we're all familiar with that, I think, given the space that we're in. And like the fact that you mentioned how education is structured as well, and the fact that we're all created to be these like worker bees, I completely resonate with that. I am one of those worker bees. I didn't go to Stanford, Yale, Harvard, Oxford. I just went to like my local tech college and learned, you know, information technology and stuff. And it was only like a decade later I realized, holy shit, I was just like churned out to get a job for a big tech company. And I'm not like, I don't have entrepreneur DNA. I have to learn it. And that was quite an insight and a revelation, you know. But I think, again, a lot of this stuff is sort of obvious to a lot of the people in this space. Like they realize there's something very, very wrong with the way the world is structured. But I think what I'm like, you know, the question that could prompt is like, well, we should do something. But the problem is it's like, what impact are you actually going to have if you just rush off and try to create something like Bitcoin? And not to take that away, like Bitcoin is an incredible human innovation. It's like a huge leap forward, but is it being used widely? It's been kind of used as a sort of like hedge against fiat, and it's been used potentially as an investment, and it's been used as a store of value, sure. And Ethereum has been used pretty widely now in terms of its adoption, but if I go into an urban center anywhere in the world, I won't see people using Ethereum. I won't see people using Bitcoin. At what point will they start turning to that? And I think that's an interesting question. And I think we've seen examples of that. And most of the time, when you look at those examples, they're pretty grim. But I'm thinking of like when people started turning to crypto and other systems, when there were like previous economic crisis in Nigeria, in Venezuela, you know, when they actually were forced to turn to alternative systems. That's the point that I'm thinking that actually a lot of the stuff that we've built that's kind of largely not being used today will be the first thing that people turn to tomorrow. And that's an interesting question, you know. The question is like, what will they turn to? What sorts of local economies are going to emerge to help people survive? You know, and are you going to have this like two-tier economy where you have like, you know, millionaires at the top, billionaires at the top owning, you know, everything and accounting for all of the GDP that's being tracked from a country, while you have this other shadow economy that's largely not being accounted for, but for which 80% of the population depend? And what sort of technology are they going to use? I'm interested, Sterling, you know, from your perspective working with Logos, how do you think that they're, as a thought experiment, how would, for example, the Logos tech stack between, you know, the various different pieces of technology, how would that map onto something that people would actually use in terms of like, you know, a survival economy, if you want to call it that?
Yeah, definitely happy to get into that. Before I do, real quick, I just want to everyone who's in the space. We're having a really critical discussion, and I think Simon here is the perfect person to have it with. You guys, please make sure that you like and share the space to get the word out, because what we're working on here is pretty novel in terms of some of the other activities that are happening largely in the blockchain space. So definitely like and share the space. Simon here is a brilliant articulator of these particular ideas. And thank you again for being here. Okay, cool. So yeah, let me try to answer that question. So one of the out of the gate, I think what's happening worldwide, and at least within our communities, this isn't to say that it's happening everywhere, but there's a spark or there's an ignition of an alternative idea of how we should structure society. So what we have now are these blockchain communities that have decided to start creating or deploying parallel societies as well. And riding underneath the surface of the development and the deployment of these parallel societies is the idea that we can restructure society in a way that is more hospitable to the every person, right? And so one of the things that comes along with these parallel societies and parallel communities is that you need, in order to structure them, you need new governance applications, you need new and novel coordination mechanisms, you need the ability to store your data in a privacy preserving and anonymity enhanced way in order to protect the individuals that are in those communities from various threat vectors, including legacy structures that are failing and trying to take people down with it. So very clearly, the application of the Logos technology stack is for the implementation of these governance applications for the use in parallel societies, right? And it's just so critical that we have sort of these cypherpunk and crypto anarchist principles embedded in these communities, because these communities are certainly and 100% prone to being at risk from not only the traditional structures, but also just random threat actors in the world who see them as being small, vulnerable, and open to different kinds of attacks. A lot of actors also know that some of these communities come with blockchain wealth, right? And this is one of the, by the way, this is as a side point, one of the beautiful things that happened with the cryptocurrency revolution is we have seen this vast transfer of wealth from sort of the old aristocratic moneyed elite into the hands of these individuals who are, more quote unquote nerdy and more geeky and represent sort of a different kind of community than the traditional old guard has represented. And I think that's an amazing thing. We need these different personality types who have largely been underrepresented and maybe have even previously been victims of wealth inequality, so to speak, right? They were in a different sort of bracket of existence and of subsistence within a community, and now they have a position of higher wealth, higher earning potential, and now they can use that along with their philosophy, right, which is largely crypto anarchic, cypherpunk. These individuals understand the nature of the system, and now they have the capital and the ability to create change and to really push this paradigm shift forward. And so Logos represents one part of that story arc, right? Where we have the technology and the potential to let these communities flourish, right? I think at the end of the day, it's all about not only retooling like this our civic infrastructure, but it's also about unleashing the full potential of the human species, right? Through collective betterment, holistic betterment, and human flourishing, right? Because humans can't flourish in an environment of unsustainable economic development. It can't flourish in an environment of a zero sum game, Molochian dynamics, where as a result of that, by the way, we've mentioned the meaning crisis a lot in our spaces, but we have a situation where people are feeling more isolated, more alienated, more depressed, and more suicidal than ever because they've lost contact with their fellow human beings. They've lost that intimate component, that need for touch, that need for communication, that need for humanness that is at the center of our very essence, right? So now I really think Logos, underlying all the technology, is representative of this optimistic change and this reignition of the human spirit and this reconnectivity of human communication and our really, it's like we're learning or relearning how to be into contact with each other again on a local level. And this is, I think, why, guys, and Simon, we have this push for localism, right? Localism is a kind of becoming a buzzwords in some aspects of the Web3 community, especially within the so-called regenerative financial community, because there's a part of us that wants to get back to the solidarity and the human connections that we have in the context of these local communities. And I think that is a beautiful thing for us to aspire to. And I know you've in your notes, you even mentioned a bit about localism and Michelle Bowen's work as well, cosmolocalism, which plays into this and also has an economic component. So those are a few thoughts on also of how the Logos technology stack and really Logos ethos fits into this overarching vision or mission.
Yeah, that's great, man. There's just so much in there that I resonate with, and like the fact that you use the word parallel societies. And I was kind of like when I was thinking about this earlier, I was using sort of like a shadow economy, and I came up with something called a force majeure principle. That it's like the inflection point that kind of forces people to reach for a solution that will work at that moment. Um, and but like the solution could be things that are kind of like experiments at the moment, right? So if you think about, for example, local exchange trading systems or rotating savings and credit associations, community inclusion currencies and stuff like that, time banks, like things that have sort of worked at a very small scale, but people don't use right now. Like people use traditional banking, more and more sort of like traditional banking on DeFi rails, or maybe a credit union, but they don't go so far as to use these things that actually sort of like are more kind of pre-nation technologies. But I think they're going to come back, and I think they're going to come back at a local level, but very much, as you mentioned, I'm very inspired by Michelle Bowen's ideas around Cosmo Local, because I think the technology we've built will actually enable this sort of Cosmo Local knowledge sharing that will bring back these pre-nation technologies that on a very local level that will be technologically enhanced and that will actually work. And so what you're going to start seeing is, yeah, I think maybe parallel societies is what we could call them. And maybe I'm using that term incorrectly, but that's where I see these like small societies. And the thing is, you can't turn on and like what's the station? Like you can't turn on like CNN or like Twitter or like any of these huge media outlets or information dissemination machines and see what's happening, because it's too local, right? Like you can read what's happening, but it's not actually, it's totally disconnected from what's happening. The only way to find out what's happening is to engage with the people around you, and through them, through this cosmolocal network, find out what's actually happening in the world. That to me is incredibly interesting. That's the point. That's the sort of inflection point where we go from what we take for granted today. We're all logging on to X. We're all like, getting our news from whatever, big outlet it is. All the community groups I know are using WhatsApp and Facebook and everything. But that's going to change, and it's going to change out of necessity, because people will have to find other ways to trade and barter and actually create an economy that works for them so that they can survive. I really do see that that's coming. And so the point at which the pain that people feel drives them to reach out for a solution that works for them at that moment is the question that drives me the most at the moment. And that's where I love seeing where Logos is going, because they're thinking about not just the technology and the anti-fragility and the cypherpunk principles, but the usability and actually getting it to the point where people can reach for it when they need it. That really excites me. I'd love to know if anyone has opinions on this, though. I feel like I've just been waffling for ages.
Oh, we are very much aligned. I think Sterling is floating in the ether below us here. Something that's been on my mind constantly, especially as the Circles initiative has gone, and as it has evolved in Los Angeles specifically, is I've arrived at the same. Oh, you're probably hearing. Sorry, hold on. Mm, I have to mute myself. Sorry, guys.
Yeah,
But
it's all good. It's all good. I'm back. So, yeah, Simon. Yeah, the X is being a bit laggy today. I was in a space earlier and it was acting up. No, Simon, extremely well said. I think you hit on something that really resonated to me as a profound insight. It's this idea, and it also speaks to the meaning crisis that we're having to deal with. In some ways, all the news, like a good chunk of the input that is pushed and peddled by the legacy institutions, right? These are like the mainstream media outlets. In some ways, it's kind of all fake news, right? Because it's much of it, if it's not just outright propaganda, it's not relevant to your local circumstances. It's not relevant to your local communities. And in that way, I guess it can be considered propaganda, because the idea is to train your brain to focus on legacy politics, right? It's to focus on concerns of the system's elites, and those individuals. Whereas I think all of us understand, if we have a local community, the concerns then become more localized and right, and thus more manageable, right? Where we can have agency and impact over what's happening in those communities. And I think this also is partially representative of your like force majeure principle, where a critical mass of people begin to understand that the nature of the system that they're in, where they wake up to it, but they also see that communities are coming online that share their values and share their beliefs. And I think this is a key component of it. It doesn't necessarily even have to be a physical community. These blockchain communities that are already extremely prevalent online represent a wellspring of value share for individuals who focus on a particular kind of community or a particular thesis or idea or whatever it is, and they gravitate toward those communities. And it's not all just strictly based on the economics of those systems, and a lot of times it is, but it's not always. There's also certain kind of mimetic structures, certain types of understanding and communication that happens in these ecosystems that builds communities, right? And that solidifies those communities so that they can grow. And I think this is part of that transition point, and we're seeing it blossom and bloom outward right now, right in front of us. And I think that's something that you hinted at, and it really stuck with me when you were talking about the situation as it concerns really the media architecture and the media landscape that we find ourselves in. It really reminds me, right, of Marshall McLuhan's work. This notion that the medium is the message, right? The community is the message in this sense, and it's also what constructs this global village that he talked about in his work, really looking into the future.
I love that you brought that up. It's so pertinent. Yeah, the medium is the message, and as Martin McLuhan quite rightly said, yeah, this kind of global village. But I think he envisaged a global village, whereas we're talking about is global villages, and this kind of interconnectedness of localism, which is really only possible because of the technology that we have. But I think that on one hand, I'm kind of looking forward to this sudden paradigm shift where we go from like what we're used to, which is just like staring at our laptops and logging on to crypto Twitter, to this new kind of paradigm of like talking to people, but in a way that we have technology that can connect our local environments across borders. But to be clear, I'm definitely not a tech utopianist, right? I'm not picturing the sort of like the dawning of the age of Aquarius, where the technology fixes all of our needs, right? Like, if anything, I'm more of a doomer. I think, what the reason people are going to turn to this technology and this new paradigm is because we're going to be in this sort of grim dystopia. I'm sorry to everyone to kind of paint that picture, but it's the kind of where we're going. It is the force majeure. It is the inflection point. It's what finally turns us to embracing things that we need to embrace in order to survive, right? And so, yeah, I'm sorry, that is a bit grim. But on the other hand, it is kind of exciting to see what results from that and what grows from that. I think, I think, is it Ray Dalio? Or I know Joe Lubin has talked about this sort of like idea of the super cycle. And we reach the end of the super cycle and then a new one begins. And you can think about it academically like that. I think on the ground, it's going to be a little bit more real. But I think it's going to be interesting. I mean, to speak concretely about it, some of the people who really inspire me, apart from Sterling, who really inspires me with his work, but Will Ruddock is he's just been incredible in terms of the work that he's done over the past 20 years. And if you look at sort of like his idea of like the Sarafu network, where they've had commitment pools, and like from the the Western perspective, you're talking about a shadow economy, right? Like a cash-based economy, and a lot of people will kind of look down on that, especially people in crypto, right? In terms of working on the more financialized aspect of crypto, they'll just kind of laugh at it, right? The numbers are like this. There's like about 40 in 2021. They had 48,000 registered users, and they facilitated 2.5 million worth of transactions in a year. That's why people in crypto laugh at it. Like last September, I raised 2.5 million in the seed round to like, build out some pretty cool ideas. But like my team has 10 people. These had 48,000 people sustaining themselves in a local economy. That's incredible, right? And it proves that these sort of systems, these sort of what I call like pre-nation mechanisms, they actually work. They work on the ground, and they work for people who really need them to work. Now, I think we're going to see a resurgence of these things, and the people today who are kind of laughing at them because of like the small market cap sort of thing, I think they're going to start going, oh, wow, there's actually a prevalence of these things. But again, they're not going to be in this like huge blue chip DApp that everyone uses. It's going to be an interlinked, organic, local, sort of like much more kind of like localized and much more fluid and permeable. And I understand all the counter arguments. I understand why you need this global numeraire, why you need this sort of like petrodollar, right? So that creates, like liquidity across the world and allows, the global kind of like modern marketplaces to function. But I think they can complement each other, and I think they're going to have to, right? If you look at the sort of like the figures recently, I read something from the Co-Bessie letter, if you know that, that says like the top 10% of US earners reflect 49% of all consumer spending, right? At the same time, the bottom 80% of earners, this is in the United States, right? They represent just 37% of total consumer expenditures. And then when you map that to like GDP, because like consumer spending is part of GDP, but not all of it, the top 10% recorded 33% of US GDP, and the 68%, and so like that's, sorry, the top 10% recorded 33%, while the bottom 80% account for just 25% of the US economy. Right? That's happening today. So you can already see this bifurcation between, this sort of like what we're measuring today and what we're used to in terms of GDP, and this kind of lower level sort of like economy that's going to get pushed further and further down until people are going to start embracing these sort of more shadow banking, if you want to call it that. But I would say more kind of cosmo-local, pre-nation, different alternative ways of actually, creating economies. And again, the difference is we're going to have technologies like Logos that actually empower people to do this. Even if the state doesn't want them to. That's exciting.
Man, yeah, it's just extremely exciting. There's a couple things you touched on. I want to really get into the current status quo and your comment on this being more of a bleak view. But first, I do want to say that what we're trying to build here, what the developers not only at Logos but in our parallel society ecosystem are trying to do is to retool civic society in many ways. It's an understanding that this isn't a utopian vision per se, right? In that it's like idyllic, but it has it because it has a deep understanding, and we have a deep understanding that the world is 100% in dire straits as a result of its current position and as a result of the ongoing accumulation of the toxic byproducts of this system, right? So this is work that we're trying to do to remedy this. But I think it's kind of funny there so in cognitive uh, or specifically in CBT, right? Cognitive behavioral therapy, there's this idea called reframing, right? Where you look at something and your thoughts are negative about that, and it causes you emotional distress, right? So one of the things that a cognitive behavioral therapist would say is that what you have to do is reframe that thought. Look at the problem or the issue differently. So this is kind of how I look at our current scenario. It is 100% dystopian, right? We have a poly crisis of unprecedented proportions, but another way to look at this is also this crises that we're in represents great opportunity, and it also represents paradigmatic change. It's no wonder that Terence McKenna kind of humorously said, "This is what it's like when a species prepares to depart for the stars. You don't depart for the stars under calm and orderly conditions. It's a fire in a madhouse," and that's what we have: the fire in the madhouse at the end of time. I think that's a beautiful quote, because what it's suggesting is that we're on the precipice of great change on a planetary scale. Ironically, of course, it's happening with a variety of local people coming together, or people coming together in communities that are developing technologies on a local level that help free us from these traditional systems. And what this really changes is how we relate and how we interrelate as human beings. And I really do think it's like, if a person, the situation that we're in, if a person had never seen or heard of a birth or the birthing process, if you were to walk around the corner and see that, I think this is a reference Terence McKenna gave like loosely, and you were to witness that, and there's blood and there's writhing and there's pain and there's screaming and a new body is being born, that would be a very traumatic, and is a very traumatic event. But really what it's representative of is new life, of change, right? From the chrysalis into a butterfly. So I think it's just about reframing the way that we see our current situation, and understanding that what it represents change, it represents new beginnings, new starts, and a shift in the way that we function as a species, right? Really moving from a form of adolescence into a form of adulthood. At least that's how I see where we're at now. In just a brief comment we can discuss for a minute. By the way, guys, we're going to talk. We'll have a conversation for about another 10 minutes, but you guys are welcome to come up at any time and engage in this really stimulating conversation with us. So you've talked a bit, Simon, about the idea of GDP, right? And this being like a very, a measure of the health of different legacy nation states and structures. Just an interesting comment on GDP. I think one of the things that a lot of us are realizing as we develop the parallel society ecosystem, and this is already something that's happening in different micronations like Bhutan, is that GDP is 100% not indicative of the happiness and the well-being of the people within those communities. What it's just a measure of is the economic output of those communities, which doesn't say anything about how happy those communities are, how much they're flourishing, right? Because economics alone, right, having a lot of economic output in a community does not necessarily equate to human flourishing. And we see that very clearly, right? The GDP of the US is very high, but we also have a massive meaning crisis on our hands, right? A lot of what sociologist Emil Durkheim called anomie, a lot of emotional depressiveness, sadness, suicidality, etc. So now changing those parameters, and on a local scale, us thinking about how can we keep our communities happy, right? While also ensuring that we have a fair economic system that doesn't generate the dis-ease and the unhappiness that has a tendency to grow up in these communities. And this is a whole nother discussion that we could get into, but I largely think why the institutions are failing is really structural, like foundational. It's that the institutions that have been crafted in the past, not only were they designed like this, but they have inherently broken incentive structures built into them that create these like really prisoner dilemma like dynamics that cause perverse incentives, and that also create a situation where the worst among us rise to the top and get the most accolades and the most surplus in those societies, that ends up causing a larger breakdown in human well-being and human flourishing. And this goes back to the original thing that you were talking about, Simon, with this issues of economic inequality and other governance failures, et cetera, my friend.
Yeah, yeah. No, you're dead right. And the system as it is does reward the worst behavior. I look back and I think if I had spent my career just being a backstabbing snake, I'd be a lot wealthier. I don't know, maybe that's an excuse, but yeah, like that does seem to be the way the world is structured. But again, I like some of the comments you said are so interesting because, like, how do we create sort of systems that don't depress people's optimism and happiness? And some of the work that really inspired me is by Pooja Alhaver, who she really she did a lot of work around community currencies, but in a way that sort of like is a very non-financial, right? It's that community currencies that allow communities to coordinate and create governance structures that recreate physical boundaries in the digital and protect them against sort of outside influence. So, I protect them against the millionaires who just want to come in and, bribe people or buy people off or just generally interfere, right? And when I see her work and some of the exploration that she's dedicating herself to, it gives me a lot of hope. But I think there is some work to be done between the sort of like brilliant kind of academic work that people like you, Sterling, and Pooja Oliver, Michelle Bounds are doing currently that's so important. And then the everyday use cases that will like bridge the gap to people across the world in all different kind of walks of life. I think that's sort of driven me of late to become more and more interested in actually just like product and just general tech product management and how you actually create a product that is like people can just reach for and they just grab when they need it and find out at which moment they're likely to do that. um, and a lot of it, the literature around that is pretty dry and boring. It's just like marketing and sales and stuff like that. But what drives me to learn all of that kind of stuff is because, that's what bridges the gap, right? So, I mean, let me give you an example, right? We talk about like this sort of force majeure where people are like starting to turn to alternative mechanisms, right, for their everyday needs, right? A lot of that happens already, but it happens with cash. And it's long been regarded that the black economy is sort of being part of the larger economy, and it's kind of factored in, but it's sort of unquantifiable because it's like paper notes being, exchanging hands, and that's totally fine. And it's important. But what we're seeing now is that in large parts of Europe, like France and Spain, any business transacting over $1,000 in cash is illegal. And then you've got the EU and Christine Lagarde talking about imposing a union-wide $10,000 cap on cash payments by 2027. I guarantee you that's going to be probably more like 3,000. And then if we start seeing like central bank digital currencies or even centralized stable coins, I don't see much of a difference personally, then you're going to see a lot of those similar sort of impositions in the digital as well. So what happens then? And that's the point at which people will need to turn to traditionally Monero or Zcash or something like that. They're not going to. I can tell you that now. They're just not going to because it's too difficult. It's too much of a learning curve, and it's basically alien. And most people aren't even aware of them that they exist. Um, so you need to bridge that gap somehow, and that sort of infiltration to everyday life through usability and through meeting people where they are and through the tenacity of staying the course so that when things get bad enough, the moment at which people reach for these incredible technologies is the moment of connection. And that's when amazing things will happen. So that's what's kind of most interesting me at the moment in the space and sort of the direction my journey is taking me.
Yeah, I really love your comments too. I missed it earlier because you had mentioned it before, but thinking about Black economies and informal economies and their impact on the world, I think it's 100% growing. I think about countries like Mexico, where most people automatically have an innate distrust to their banking system, to the government. They don't feel like their money is safe in the banks, and most everything that occurs there is cash based, right? It's a cash based economy. But some of these communities have also created their own kinds of currency. Some of them have even got really unique with it. Uh, one, there's this one city that has these, I forget the name of it. I'll have to look it up and I can publish it in the space notes. but they have these little like gaming, look like gaming coupons, and they're actually using this as a form of currency throughout Mexico, but also very specifically in that city. So they get very creative in the ways that they use currencies. And I think this is an important component of this discussion because, going back to the idea of wealth inequality, one way to solve any semblance of wealth economy and to mitigate the extractive principles by which our legacy structures function is that we simply stop using the traditional structures and their monies and we create our own. All right. That was, the original discussion. We were talking about the invention of Bitcoin and a variety of different cryptocurrencies was to create our own quote unquote money printer, our own way to transact and to do money transactions without having to worry about being exploited. And that's not to say by any stretch of the imagination that it's been perfect in crypto. Certainly there's plenty of extractive and exploitative companies, but at least now we have the choice to go about looking at our own kind of cryptocurrency projects that we want to invest in or belong to. And I think that is really critical for developing this new world and also empowering our local communities in ways that they haven't been empowered before. So this is part of that force majeure principle that you mentioned, but it really is incumbent upon us to continue spreading the criticality of these informal and Black economies as well. This is also why I'm a fan. Something we haven't talked about a lot on this space that we can maybe get into in other spaces as well is the work by philosopher Samuel Edward Konkin III. He wrote a book on the topic called agorism, and agorism is this philosophy where you actively go out and transact on the black market and create black and gray circular economies in order to purposely destabilize traditional structures. And I think agorism as a philosophy, it's been very instrumental in my own development, my own thought process, and I think it's a really beautiful philosophy. But I think it's kind of humorous because we don't actually actively have to go out and try to destabilize these governments, as Peter and Jared point out in their book Farewell to Westphalia. Already a lot of governance services, a lot of quote unquote coordination services are being outsourced to a lot of different entities, including cartels. Like uh, that's obviously not a good thing, but it is suggestive of the fact that governments largely, nation states largely, are losing their power. They're ceding a lot of their territory to a lot of different organizations, multinational organizations, multinational cartels, local governance associations. And so what we're seeing is a splintering off of governance provision by the traditional nation state. And this is, I think, very representative of this conversation that we're in the midst of a coordination collapse with legacy nations. And that's why we're here. And we use this terminology of rebuilding civic society. We're rebuilding civic society by developing the infrastructure and the necessary and sufficient conditions to have new human communities that are able to flourish of their own means. And of course, we mentioned cosmolocalism, Michel Bowen's work. I think his like economic design thinking is really critical for figuring out how we can structure our local communities economically so that they can succeed, right? And by the way, for anybody who's not familiar with the concepts of cosmolocalism, I really recommend following Michel Bowen's work. And just to define it briefly, what it means is that we should have everything that's hard, right? Like manufacturing and agriculture, local, right? That should be developed locally, but any kind of design or structuring for the hard development can be done globally, right? So there's like a knowledge commons or a sharing commons that we tap into to empower our local communities. This is also part of the economic and institutional structuring of the global village, as Marshall McLuhan called it. Oh, by the way, so I'm going to let Simon respond to that, guys. We are at the top of the hour. I think right now is a really good time to reset the room. This has been a phenomenal conversation. This is a conversation that I personally really adore, and I'm glad Simon is here to articulate his position. He very much is on the forefront of the way that society is changing and the way that we're working to rebuild our civic society. So we want to thank him for his work, and being involved on our space as well, and being part of the Logos community. So you guys, if you want to come up and you want to ask questions or engage in the conversation, you're more than welcome to do that. And if it's just a question, that's fine. Or if you have a comment, that's good. But always let's keep it topical and relevant. Simon, you can respond, and we do have a question. I'm going to let Simon respond, and then Chair can ask his question or engage in a comment.
No, I'm eager to hear questions and thoughts from other people. So yeah, if there's a question, please shoot.
Yeah, it's I think my audio is better. Please let me know if it is not immediately, so I don't torture anyone. But going back to the point earlier, as Sterling was making his way back, and thinking about what is the breaking point where people and it probably at this point it varies. What is the breaking point where people realize they need to use more private tools, or start relying on themselves, or different non-legacy institutions for things? But nobody really cares until it affects them specifically, until they have a very good and urgent reason to be private or transact privately, or so on. But food is the breaking point for everyone, and food supply and food source. And the timing, like it be as soon as you cannot guarantee water and food, the paradigm shifts for everyone, and a countdown clock begins. And the critical thing, from my perspective, the most critical thing that we can do, or one of the most, is be able to coordinate locally. Well, Michelle Bowens, I keep trying to think of his exact quote because he thinks something like locally versus globally. I think it's like coordinate locally, operate globally, or operate locally, coordinate. I need to go back. I need to go back to look at it. But within that, the coordinating locally part, in that as soon as you don't have water or food that you can rely on, you will have to rely on whatever the legacy system will provide for you. And that requires playing their game and doing their dance and scanning your face and so on and so forth. Though we all probably have already had our faces scanned, and that's very sad. So from the local perspective, especially from the Los Angeles Circle perspective, I would really like to get to a point where we can coordinate locally on anything, keep it high level, but then from there, go towards how do we coordinate food distribution from producers to consumers at a local level. You know, and God forbid we'll ever actually need it, but Simon, I think you and I are aligned that it's that breaking point is coming. More and more people are starting to reach it. That wasn't a question. That was a bloviation, but bear with me.
No, for sure. But I mean, yeah, you're dead right. Like, I think, what was it? The IMF said that sort of like, the dark economy, black economy, what the shadow economy, whatever you want to call it, it's like kind of 15% or something like that. I don't know. I have no idea of knowing if that's accurate. I think it goes up to like 30, 40, 50% once you kind of go back when you reach sort of like quote unquote developing countries, right? And so that's not by what you're describing. I think that's just people just getting on with it, but they're getting on with it in a way that doesn't rely or have a dependency on these like large financial institutions and on KYC, AML, and just mass surveillance, right? They're just getting on with it. The problem is that it's going to become harder. And in the West, where the shadow economy, okay, so the IMF tells us it's 15%, but how do we know? We know it's probably more than likely going to grow. If that shadow economy starts, bumping up against, well, cash restrictions like we're seeing in the EU, like in France, where it's like illegal to spend more than like, I think it's like €1,000 or something in cash, right? So if it starts like, coming up against money transmitter regulations or, other sort of like regulations like that, that's enforced through technology. Lest we forget, I think all of us just use Apple Pay and Google Pay all the time, right? Unless you're like me and trying to have banknotes. But even then, it's like really difficult. So my point is this shadow economy that's on one hand growing, like we can reasonably suggest that it's growing. And concurrently, you've got this downward pressure that's trying to prohibit the normal activities of these shadows economy. Like, what happens then? And so that's where we can only speculate, but we can look at previous examples, like Eastern Bloc countries after like the kind of post-Soviet era collapse. There was a lot of this sort of like shadow economy stuff. I guess that's not a good example because it predates the sort of technology we're talking about. But maybe like when you look at sort of
Those
like
were scary situations, those post-Soviet 90s era.
they were, and you saw a lot of like kind of bartering and a lot of like local sort of impromptu coordination, right? But like when you look at sort of like places like Venezuela, Nigeria, like Argentina, maybe going back as 2001, you started to see kind of these local exchange trading systems and stuff. But I think more recently, like in Venezuela, you start to see people actually using crypto, right? And so you can see precedent for what people might do under those situations, but it's hard to know for sure, right? I think it's an open question and an area of exploration I'm interested in.
Nice. Appreciate the discussion points there, Chair and Simon. Great answer. We have now Privacy Mage up here, who's part of the community, a good person, a good speaker. Privacy Mage, welcome to the stage.
Hey, thanks for having me. Yeah, I just wanted to say a couple things. There's something I wrote the other day, which when you were talking, Chair, I just thought of, and there's an article and it's also a book called The Lexus and the Olive Tree that was written in '99 by Friedman, and it's the Lexus is representative of globalization or the speed of connecting, and the olive tree is representative of like your identity or your roots. And the thing is that the Lexus is a Tesla now, and the olive tree still takes decades to fruit. And I think when I was thinking about that water and food thing, it's like, how are we going to feed our olive tree if it takes decades for it to feed ourselves, if the olive tree takes decades in order to fruit? And we need to kind of build those identity systems now because the Tesla's only getting faster and faster. Anyway, I just found that analogy matched with what you were talking about, so it's kind of cool.
That's a perfect that captures it right there, and that it's going to take a while, some time, in order for us for the systems of like, oh, hold on, I might be echoing again, for those systems to take fruit, to take hold, for them to be ironed out and fleshed out and dog fooded so that people can rely on it. Then I need my grains and dairy this week, this month, this year for my family, or even just myself. But those production lines and distribution lines that we rely on now have been established over hundreds of years. And certainly there are thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years of human history before what we're used to now of people being able to survive. But like, anyway, like whatever we're going to rely on, people need to be working on it now with whatever is available, so that jumping point is going to happen. And it's that at that point, it's not going to be the time to test new systems. It's going to be the time to rely on what we know works, and we don't know what works yet, not even close, when it comes to food.
100%, man. Yeah, we need to test it, and test it with like as if it's a product, as if it's a tech product that's going like an app on the App Store. But I will say that the point you raised is why I have so much immense respect and admiration for all the people in the Locust community and the work you guys are doing now, because you are the ones who have that foresight.
Thank you. The thing that I was picking up from what you were speaking about, Simon, was it's always in the gap. So the space between either us, or whether or not that's like a relationship we build, or we build something in between, or whether or not we maintain a gap in order to have a space to express sovereignty. And like that gap must always exist, I think, is an important thing that I took from when you were speaking. Yeah.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit more? I'm kind of interested in that perspective, actually. I mean, you're saying it's my perspective, but I'm just interested in kind of like what you saw in that, and if you could talk to it a little bit more.
Hmm. I've been looking into something recently called promise graphs, and I think what builds the line between two people. So if you imagine two people to be nodes, is someone following through on a promise, like that makes the line stronger, and that is what I find analogous with the gap. So there's a gap between us. What is the understanding that we need to reach within what context? And that can be anything. It could be like how to chop wood better, and you're pretty good at chopping wood, so we've got a gap between us, and there has to be a way that we need to express that in order to build the difference. Like there needs to be some sort of communication in the middle, and if we completely like collapse into having no gap between us, then that's like a pretty centralized system, like a completely centralized system where it's like that's being dictated. This is how you chop wood, and we both follow that protocol of like swinging the axe this way. But if I see you, I observe you, and I'm like, nah, he adds like an extra oomph to his swing because he moves his left leg in this way. There's a gap between us, and I'm just like, oh, cool. Okay, let me work out that difference. And yeah, that's the thing that we have to protect. That's kind of what I meant.
Right. Okay. That's actually amazing. It opens up so many different things that I've been noodling on for the past year, especially in the area of sort of like the stuff that we've been working on our side with like on-chain agreements, where people create these lightweight agreements with each other, for things that have meaningful value in terms of the outcome of the agreement. And then you can surface these agreement graphs that essentially, the agreements and how they worked out between all of these different parties. But I think what you're describing brings it one step further, where you're kind of like measuring the gaps or degrees of separation, as well as the value and what it, the intersubjective value between the participants. Very, very
Yeah,
interesting. So
and
I've got that
like
written down. I'm
another.
gonna,
Yeah, we can chat about this for a while.
yeah, I'd love
I
to.
get that sense, but another way like to imagine it is like we both come with different polarities. So like I'm signaling an idea to you, so that has like a positive polarity, and then you need to show me your like negative polarity, so something that you understand as real and truth, and then they connect, and then the graph gets stronger. Getting a little bit theoretical here, but yeah, that's what I thought about when you responded.
Super interesting.
I love that we have Privacy Mage up here casting a level 98 spell, wielding a legendary unique staff that only drops
Thank
from
you,
the
sir.
highest level boss, the final boss in the dungeon. Now, great, great conversation. One of the things too, I think of, I mean, really what we're building in terms of these local communities, thinking about your promise graph, Privacy Mage, is like we're really trying to create high fidelity, high trust environments, and very naturally in a local community there's already going to be more incentive, whether that local community is digital or like a physical community. There is a strong need for the people there to not only to have trust, but to allow the trust to rise to such a level that there's a very strong kinship ties in those communities. This is something that goes back to ancient times as well. I mean, all of Gaelic Ireland, I've talked about Gaelic Ireland, I think, in some of our spaces before, but all those tribal communities were built on an edifice of kinship ties and kinship trust and kinship networks. And that's what really held those communities together. And this is also why they did not need a king or a monarch. They had one, but it was really just a ceremonial position. They didn't really wield any kind of accumulated power in those systems. And instead, there were just private individuals called brehons who, if someone had a problem with another person, everyone trusted this individual to uh, arbitrate, right, and to find a solution to that problem. So really what we're talking about too are reputational networks in these communities. And I feel like what you're working on, both of you guys in tech, is just a a representation of really the same form of interaction, regardless if it's governance or coordination or arbitrating a dispute, or whether it's in the realm of economics and you're facilitating some kind of quote unquote trustless trade or whatever that is. We're just re-envisioning certain kinds of dynamics that have existed before without the technology that we have today in various ways.
A little known fact, because I'm Irish and I'm based in Ireland, and from studying kind of like Irish history, when we first created the Republic, we tried to actually bring back Brehon law and make it our fundamental system of law, but it was so complicated to update a 700-year or like 800-year-old legal system that we sort of gave up. But it's really interesting. I'm really glad you brought that up.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite societies to study, right? Most people are like, this is just an older thought, right? When I was really pontificating a lot on voluntarism and libertarianism specifically, everyone's like, well, that's never been tried before. Well, yes, actually it has, right? Go look at Gaelic Ireland, which was largely libertarian. Not going to say that it was perfect or there wasn't elements of barbarism, just like any other kind of culture. Certainly not utopia, but they didn't have a centralized like monarchical style of ruler, and they lasted. Gaelic Ireland, which was largely sustained on oral tradition, lasted some 2,000 years. Most people aren't even really aware of the length. It only, of course, the society only began to decay, and they only lost some of the materials after like the monarchs of England started to sweep into Ireland and take over, sadly enough. But I know you're well aware of the historical background of the situation, Simon. But I think it's a really interesting case study for those of us looking at restructuring and retooling civic society today, because there are implementations of different governance and coordination mechanisms that we can implement from the past into today. We don't have to reinvent the wheel in every domain, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think what our task is probably just like inventing the technology to allow people to invent what they need to invent. I think Ethereum has done an incredible job of that. And maybe you can say to a degree it has sort of been, I won't say captured, that's too strong, but over financialized perhaps. And it feels like a lot of the people who've been working in this space, including myself, have sort of feel like we've just been working in servitude to the sort of the traditional finance. But I do need to remind myself that this space is full of incredible people who are very passionate and dedicated and here for a reason. And the groundwork that we've laid will allow people to actually, create things that will work for them, including, as you said, like, for example, maybe like mechanisms from pre-nation state, mechanisms like Brehon law, who knows, right? I think that privacy is like obviously a huge part of that, and it's not going to work without that. But again, it gives me a lot of, heart to see the amount of focus on privacy now at the moment. Like the Cypherpunk Congress and, the kind of cypherpunk, the Web3 Privacy for All event that was in Buenos Aires was huge. And so seeing that just gave me so much encouragement. And I think when you have that sort of capability really baked into the protocol and the ecosystem and the technology, yeah, people are going to do amazing things.
Yeah, at 100%. I think we're already in the midst of a lot of different amazing applications being built. I mean, I think we're still in kind of a governance renaissance era, right? Where we're even with Logos, right? Just on the cutting edge of deploying a network, right? This is like the Logos blockchain where people can deploy governance applications and they can experiment with the way that these applications are deployed, and they can tailor make them to the needs of their community. And that's what's really critical, right? Because all the governance that we're ostensibly used to is governance that is forced upon us, right? And in normal terms, this is like statute law, right? This is like old school English law, where it's like from the top down, we're telling you what to do. What we're really re-envisioning is a new kind of polycentric legal order that previously dominated the different fiefdoms and communities around the world, right? Except now we have ways to structure it in ways that are way more trustless, and also that allow communities to build actual trust between the real people that are involved in them. So I think it's a beautiful time to be alive, and I think we're going to see a lot of different types of governance and coordination experimentation come online as a result of the work that we're collectively doing. Chair?
If anyone hasn't read it, Sterling's work on and his ideas around panarchy is a really great read, and probably already, you know, everyone here has read it. But if you haven't, it's a must read, and I think it goes into like a lot more in terms of that perspective, and it's super interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. We haven't even got into panarchy in a while in the space. We'll have to do that at some point soon. I wish we could get some of the main panarchy-based speakers on the space, but some of them don't even use X. The community's not what I would call large, still a bit of an obscure philosophy, but certainly panarchy is just the same. It's the same kind of experimental ethos that we're envisioning in the parallel society ecosystem. It's just expressed in more philosophical terms, right, within the panarchic community. It's a great thing. Thank you, Simon.
Yeah, I just want to mention, Simon mentioned it a little bit earlier. It's difficult to upgrade 1,000-year-old technology, and like that's I might be echoing again. That's a theme in Farewell to Westphalia, as well as like we're running on 400-year-old technology, and it's
That's a
not
great
it's
point.
not a perfect correlation to your point, but I think there's a lot of similarity there.
That's a great point. It is, and yeah, Jared and Peter articulate that point really well in the book. I think it's a great point. I think it's hard to argue against. Yeah, like if you think that Brehon law is arcane because it's what 800 to 1,000 years old, then you know, like what is the Westphalian Order if it's like 400 years old? Is that not arcane? It's kind of interesting, right? When you put it in that perspective.
Cool. Well, I think right now if maybe we can have probably a couple of more final questions or comments. If any of you guys want to come up and have a conversation with us, you can ask Simon a question as well. This has been a really fantastic discussion, Simon. I'm glad we got you on to talk about this. And then after that, we'll start to close the space down. But before anybody comes up, maybe we can take just some time to revisit the initial question that we had, Simon, about wealth inequality and its implications. Maybe you can kind of summarize your primary thesis for the audience, and also summarize the direction that we're headed, and what the future looks like, at least in your view.
I am often a very verbose person, so I will do my best to summarize. Essentially, I wouldn't say it's a thesis, but something that I'm like a thought that I'm in the process of forming, which is, you know, from what I can see, we know that there's wealth inequality across the world, and we know that it is increasing, and it's increasing probably exponentially, right? This is like a very well-established trend, and that. So if you follow that to its logical conclusion, that this sort of like trajectory we're on of like wealth inequality across the world is going to reach some sort of inflection point. So if you can plot it as a curve, then it's an asymptotic event horizon, or some sort of, you know, inflection point where it reaches a critical mass, where like an analogy would be water, where if you heat it up linearly, right, it still crosses these certain thresholds where it turns from ice to liquid to gas. And so there's a critical mass points that things just like change so suddenly. And personally, I think that we are reaching that sort of inflection point sooner rather than later. And what I'm interested in is the question of what happens when we reach that inflection point where inequality has become so great that people who, you know, for right now take things for granted, such as like just being able to buy groceries, right, that can feed their family for a week, or just being able to buy a car. Forget about buying a house, because I think for Gen Z that boat is already sailed. But like, you know, more basic things than, you know, than that even, and less aspirational. Like what happens when people can't meet their everyday needs, and like what will they turn to? And so what I was surmising is that our capacity for collective coordination even if it's like a mob with like pitchforks and burning stakes or whatever, like that capacity for collective coordination is already gone. We're past that. Like the information technology we have and how it's become so centralized means that that's probably, we don't have that capacity anymore. So then what, right? So then a lot of the precedents that you turn to in the past no longer stand. You can't really point to these revolutions. If they do happen, they'd be short-lived, localized, and not very impactful. Instead, my thesis is that the shadow economy that we were used to is going to increase and going to grow, and probably already is. But it's going to come up against the sort of technological barriers that have been placed on it in terms of like financial regulation and the prohibition of cash transactions and surveillance, mass surveillance technology. And that, so you've got these two pressures, a downward pressure that I've just described from, over-regulation, over-financialization, and sort of like surveillance, and this upward pressure of this growth in the shadow economy. And where they meet in the middle is where you're going to have the emergence of this, what I think is going to be these sort of new, old mechanisms that are new to people that they rediscover and start putting in place in their local environments and communities, but in a way that's still hyper-connected across the globe. That kind of touches on sort of like ideas of cosmolocalism and stuff, which is a total rabbit hole, but that's the area that I'm most interested in. And it's where a lot of the fruition of the work that people in the locust community will actually, it will actually start to surface in people's everyday lives. That's sort of the thesis, that's sort of the question, the thoughts, the thinking that I was bringing to the space and that I wanted to kind of like, discuss with people here. So this whole conversation has really helped me think about that a lot more. And so I'll probably listen back to this podcast to just kind of like grok what, everything that the ideas that you guys brought and the opinions that you surfaced. But I would be eager to continue the conversation. I'd love to get more and more ideas and just explore questions, similar questions that other people have. So please connect to me, follow me, I'll follow you back, and then, reach out to me. And I'd love to continue the conversation.
Love it. Thanks so much, Simon. I do want to mention too, speaking to what you said about how sort of these things are being re-augmented in already people are starting to think about in terms of cosmolocalism, thinking about their local communities and how they can develop them out. Not only with digital tech or blockchain, like what we're working in, but we're also talking about practices like regenerative agriculture, different kind of permacultural setups, different ways to be sustainable without relying on the grid or the traditional utilities. And I want to mention this too because I'm heading to the People's Reset event that Derek Bros hosts in Morelia, Mexico. I'm actually flying out next week. I'm doing a talk there, and I just wanted to point out some of the different kinds of talks that are happening to help solidify Simon's point with regard to all the kind of the really cool and wild stuff and the thinking and the actual work that's happening right now. So let's see, there's on day 2 of the People's Reset, which is on January 29th, it's actually a permaculture and food independence day. So you have people there talking about, like here's a talk, if there's food left over, there is lack of awareness from abundance to waste. There's another talk called The Path to Permaculture and Community Unity. Environment awareness and hemp, the earth guides us. So those are all these really cool talks. Then you have a day on agorism and parallel networks. That's the day that I'm actually going to speak on. You have a talk by John Bush called Forged in Fire, Turning Adversity into Divine Purpose. Derek's going to talk a parallel non-AA path to recovery and healing trauma. So you have all these really cool different talks focused on different aspects. There's also a day for empowering technology. How do you define powering technology? You have Zano giving a talk, the privacy-powered digital economy. You have a guy from Cordal giving a talk, Jason Croats, Cordal implementing a new vision of the internet by the people, for the people. So you have this really mix of different focuses that come from a wide range of domains that really are geared to empowering local communities, right? So there's really this idea of mutual aid and skill sharing that is very prevalent in thinking about localism of today. And of course, Logos and Simon's work were all part of that greater network and this transition that's happening. I think it's, again, it's just a phenomenal piece of the puzzle that we're helping contribute to right now in the modern day. So yeah, I think with that said, we're at the final top of the hour. Again, Simon, thanks for your broad sweep of what we discussed. Again, extremely happy that we had this conversation and that this topic is recorded for posterity's sake. So what we're going to do now, guys, is we're going to continue pushing forward. I want to thank everyone who's in the space who came up and also spoke and added value to the conversation. So Chair, Privacy Mage, thank you so much for coming up and chatting. I want to thank all the OGs in the space who maintain and stayed here. We have Roxana here, Isaac, D. Clinch, Tiger, Matthew. We also have a lot of new faces in the space. I just want to let you guys know, if you're interested in understanding more about the Logos Network or this community, what we're up to, not only technologically, but philosophically, feel free to just reach out to any one of us. You can also click into the Logos account there, and you can view our timeline with all there's plenty of relevant information that you can glean. But we're going to continue to do this. We do the gift space every Thursday at the same time. And then also on Tuesdays, we do the Logo Circle, the online circles version of the meetup, which has become very popular. But also the movement itself is gaining a lot of momentum and pushing forward at a rapid pace. So again, thank you so much for helping catalyze this transition into a better future, for generating and cultivating holistic betterment, also for trying to retool civic society. So we want to especially thank all the developers and the engineers and the open sourcers who are working really hard to contribute to this community. Again, this is Sterling and the Logos community. Peace out from the network. Hope you guys have a good day, and I hope your new year is going fantastic. Thanks so much.